That blank moment in my meeting wasn't a personal failure or a sign of dementia. It was a temporary chemical glitch. I lost the word mitochondria in a meeting where 7 people needed me to know it. I have a PhD in neurobiology. I shouldn't forget words. I was 47 at the time. I talked around what I meant for about 30 seconds while everyone's eyes were on me. I got there in the end. But for the rest of the day, the only thing I could think about, how come I started to forget words? I assumed it was stress, or maybe I didn't get enough sleep. I even blamed English being my third language. The actual answer was that my brain was already doing something no one tells women about. It was building more estrogen receptors. These are little receiver proteins on your brain cells, neurons, whose only job is to detect estrogen. Think of them as antennas. My brain, and if you're a woman in your 40s, your brain too, is reaching out for a signal that's getting weaker. Ironically, the more antennas your brain builds during perimenopause to try and catch that fading signal, the more glitchy and out of sorts you feel. By the end of this video, you'll know where the brain fog originates in your brain, which chemicals are running it, and 3 things that can help ease the brain fog. A quick note on me. I'm a neurobiologist. I read scientific literature and work with clinical trial protocols for a living. When I started perimenopause, I couldn't find science-based information to understand my own brain. I'm sharing what I've learned so you don't have to wonder what's happening. Most of what you experience as brain fog comes down to 2 specific areas in the brain: the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex. These are 2 regions that handle the high-level cognitive work you care about most. For a long time, women were told that this foggy feeling was just symptoms of everyday stress. But modern brain imaging shows us exactly what is happening in the brain. The hippocampus is what I call your brain's librarian. Every name you ever learned, every meeting agenda, and even that word mitochondria are handled by her. Her job is to take in new information, file it exactly where it belongs, and pull it back out when you need it. Without the brain's librarian, nothing gets stored properly, and nothing comes back on demand. The hippocampus is densely packed with estrogen receptors, so we can call them antennas. It has more of those antennas than almost any other part of your brain. That tells you something important right away. Estrogen is a huge part of how your internal librarian does her job. When your estrogen is steady, she works smoothly. But when estrogen starts fluctuating widely during perimenopause, she starts dropping her filing cards. She still files things, just slower. She still looks for your memories, but you are left waiting. Sometimes she pulls the wrong drawer, and sometimes she doesn't pull out anything at all. That is exactly what causes that empty drawer feeling I experienced in my meeting. The word mitochondria was definitely in there, filed away perfectly. The librarian just could not get to it at the exact moment. We can see this happen directly on brain scans. When a research team led by Dr. Lisa Mosconi scanned living brains of women going through the menopause transition, they found that the hippocampus had one of the highest concentrations of estrogen receptors. Interestingly, the more receptors in a perimenopausal hippocampus, the worse women did on memory tests. That sounds completely backwards at first. You would think more receptors would mean better memory. But this increase in receptors is actually the brain trying to compensate. It is frantically building more antennas to catch a signal that is fading away. The harder the librarian has to reach for estrogen, the more she's struggling to file and get correct memories. So that's the hippocampus. Now, the second region behind brain fog is the prefrontal cortex. I call it your executive office. You use this area anytime you need to hold multiple things in your head, like the agenda for a meeting, the response you're about to give, or the deadline you're tracking. Your executive office decides what to focus on, what to ignore, when to switch tasks, and how to plan 3 steps ahead. It is the part of you that runs that meeting. This area is also packed with estrogen receptors. When your estrogen drops, the executive office has to work much harder to give you the same results you're used to. Researchers see on functional MRI scans that the prefrontal cortex is more active in women with lower estrogen levels, even though they got the same test scores as women with higher estrogen. Think about that for a second. The brain on less estrogen has to work harder to get the same result. Your executive office is running on overdrive just to keep things looking normal on the outside. But wait, there's more. Mosconi's team also found the brain's metabolism, or burning glucose, also drops in the perimenopausal brain. Your brain is operating on less fuel, and the prefrontal cortex happens to be one of the most energy-hungry regions in your entire brain. When you connect those two findings, everything clicks. Your executive office is working harder, but it has less fuel to do the job. The librarian is dropping her cards, and the executive office is running on overdrive with a half-empty fuel tank. Both are packed with estrogen receptors. Both are visibly struggling on the scans when estrogen drops. That's where the brain fog originates. Now that we know where the brain fog is happening, we need to look at how it's happening. The brain regions we just talked about are the physical structures, the hardware. But the brain fog itself is created by the chemistry running through them, which is the software. That brings us to neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters are the actual messages traveling between your brain cells. One cell releases a quick burst of chemicals. The next one catches them. Each neurotransmitter carries a specific message, and only its matching receptor can pick it up. Estrogen, however, isn't the message itself. It works like a dimmer switch on these chemicals. It controls how loudly each message gets sent, how clearly it gets received, and how long it stays active before it gets cleared away. When your estrogen drops, every one of these chemical systems loses part of its volume control. Let's walk through the 2 neurotransmitters that matter most for the brain fog. The first one is dopamine. Dopamine is the chemical of focus, motivation, and drive. Most people have heard that dopamine drives pleasure, but that is only a very small fraction of what dopamine actually does. Its primary job is much bigger. Dopamine is the chemical that tells your brain something is worth paying attention to. It is released when you're about to start an important task, when you're tracking a goal, or when you're trying to prioritize a massive to-do list. Dopamine flags importance. It acts like your brain's internal spotlight. Estrogen supports your dopamine system in 3 distinct ways. First, it helps your neurons produce dopamine. Second, it keeps the dopamine receptors sensitive. And third, it regulates how long dopamine stays active in the gap between neurons before it gets cleared away. That is 3 layers of support from a single hormone. When estrogen fluctuates during perimenopause, all 3 ways are affected. You still make dopamine, but less of it. Your receptors still work, but they aren't as responsive. Finally, the dopamine signal gets weak. This is exactly why you sit down to start a project, but you don't feel motivated. You stare at the screen, open 3 new tabs, check your email, and drift to something else. Then you blame yourself for lacking discipline. But discipline isn't the problem. The dopamine signal that normally tells your brain this task matters right now just isn't working properly. You also lose that small click of satisfaction, that fresh burst of dopamine that is released when you finish something. Without that chemical reward, your brain loses its momentum. This is also why women in their 40s are being diagnosed with ADHD at record rates. I covered that in depth in another video. Next neurotransmitter is acetylcholine. This is the chemical of attention and memory formation. It's definitely less famous than dopamine, and most people have never heard of it. But it runs a process inside your brain that you depend on every single second. When you meet someone new and they tell you their name, acetylcholine is what allows your internal librarian, the hippocampus, to write that down. When you walk into a room and completely forget why you're there, it means the librarian didn't use enough acetylcholine to file your intention 30 seconds ago. Think of acetylcholine as the ink your librarian uses. When the ink is strong and dark, new memories are written clearly and stay legible. But when the ink runs faint, new memories are written in light pencil and can fade. By the next day, what should have been a clear memory is completely gone. The hippocampus doesn't make its own acetylcholine or ink. It gets it from neurons in the basal forebrain. These cells send long projections up into your hippocampus, releasing acetylcholine right onto the librarian's filing cabinets. These acetylcholine-producing neurons are heavily dependent on estrogen. When estrogen drops, these cells lose their primary support system. They produce and release less acetylcholine. The librarian is still trying to do her job, but she's forced to write with fading ink. This is the root cause of the slipping name problem. You meet a client, you have a great conversation, and 5 minutes later, you can't remember their name. I have definitely been there. But I want to be clear, perimenopausal forgetfulness is not dementia. Long-term studies like the landmark SWAN study show that for most women, memory function completely bounces back once the brain settles into its postmenopausal state. This isn't permanent. It just means the chemistry of your memory is highly vulnerable right now. That blank moment in your meeting wasn't a personal failure or a sign of dementia. It was a temporary chemical glitch. If this is the kind of explanation you have been looking for, subscribe. I'm building this channel for the women who want the actual biology, not the wellness version of it. So we have the regions and we have the chemistry. The librarian needs ink and the executive office needs fuel. The question now is, what actually can help with brain fog? I want to talk about 3 things that can help. There are more, but we'll focus on 3 essential ones. They're backed by real research and connect directly to dopamine or acetylcholine. By the way, you can start doing them this week without a doctor's appointment. The first one is aerobic exercise, moving in a way that gets your heart rate up. For example, brisk walking, cycling, running, or swimming are all great options. The sweet spot is when you're breathing harder than usual, but you can still talk in short sentences. When you move at this intensity, your brain produces a molecule called BDNF, or brain-derived neurotrophic factor. I like to call BDNF fertilizer for your neurons. It protects your existing neurons and helps grow new connections between them, specifically supporting the dopamine neurons in the prefrontal cortex. There's also an immediate bonus. Right after aerobic workout, your brain releases a wave of dopamine and norepinephrine. That means the cognitive boost you get from a workout lasts for the rest of the day. The research shows a very specific dose. Aim for 20 to 30 minutes of moderate intensity aerobic exercise 3 or more times a week. Consistency over time is what matters, not a single intense workout on the weekend. Data from multiple clinical trials in women over 40 shows that this is one of the most powerful cognitive tools available. The second tool you should consider is structured cognitive training. This surprised me when I first looked at the data because brain training doesn't have a great reputation in science circles. Most apps, casual puzzles, and crosswords don't really change the brain. But one specific type of training is different. In 2025, researchers from McGill University published a study that directly measured acetylcholine production in the live human brain, the prefrontal cortex. The training group did 30 minutes a day of structured adaptive cognitive training, 5 days a week, for 10 weeks. An example of this training is where you have to spot an object in the center of your vision and something in your peripheral vision simultaneously under time pressure. As people got better, the tasks got harder. The control group played solitaire and shape matching games on the computer for the same amount of time. The training group showed an increase in acetylcholine production of about 2.3% on the brain scans. That sounds small, but it's actually enough to reverse 10 years of age-related decline. The group playing casual computer games saw zero change. This works because your acetylcholine system, the Librarian zinc supply, responds directly to demand. When you force your brain to process genuinely difficult, unfamiliar material, the brain produces more neurotransmitters. What's important, you should combine novelty with escalating difficulty. The principle applies to any complex skill. So learning a new language or mastering a difficult skill needed for your work forces your brain to stay healthier. A crossword puzzle you can do while watching TV won't cut it. Keep in mind, this study looked at people over 65. If their memory system can still bounce back at that age, your brain is going to respond even better in your 40s and 50s. Finally, let's look at what you put on your plate. Your brain builds dopamine from an amino acid called tyrosine, which comes from protein. This is incredibly important in perimenopause because your dopamine system is already working overtime. Aim for 20 to 30 grams of protein for breakfast. It will help your brain get enough of amino acids it needs to build focus for your workday. For acetylcholine, your brain needs a nutrient called choline. The best everyday source of dietary choline is egg yolks. Fish like salmon and cod are also excellent sources, while cruciferous vegetables like broccoli and Brussels sprouts can contribute. National survey data consistently shows that most women do not get enough choline. You don't need a counter full of untested supplements. The research strongly supports getting these nutrients from the whole foods because that is what your gut is built to absorb. So let's pull it all together. These 3 tools aren't trendy internet hacks. Aerobic exercise drives BDNF to protect your dopamine neurons. Structured cognitive training builds the acetylcholine your memory center needs. And whole food protein and choline give your brain the raw material to make both. They matter more now because the estrogen doesn't support your brain like before, so you should try to support it from the outside. And that's the full story. The brain fog is a physical event in 2 regions, your hippocampus, the Librarian, and your prefrontal cortex, the executive office, both packed with estrogen receptors and both working harder while dopamine and acetylcholine run without their usual support. That blank moment in my meeting wasn't a personal failure or a sign of dementia. It was a temporary chemical glitch. I'm building this channel for the woman who wants to understand her own brain at the mechanism level. If that is you, subscribe. I will see you next time.